I think an understanding of unmet need and how it might not necessarily be purely clinical is quite key. There are pains in business, in workflow efficiency. There are institutions that struggle with profitability and utilization of assets. Those are also unmet needs. In healthcare, we don't really categorize those as unmet needs usually, but in my opinion, unmet needs are broader than just the clinical medical needs. There are lots of business needs as well.
Welcome, MedTech Gurus. Today, as I mentioned in the introduction, we have a fantastic guest with us. Adrian Lam, CEO of Corvista Health, joins us to discuss how the right mix of innovation, data science, and leadership can transform how we detect and treat cardiovascular disease, particularly in the most underserved corners of healthcare. Adrian brings a unique perspective to the table. Before stepping in the operator role, he was a principal at BioWorld Partners, where he evaluated and backed early-stage healthcare companies, helping shape strategy, scale, and investor readiness. He also held leadership roles across medtech ventures, giving him a full-spectrum view of what it takes to bring breakthrough technology from idea to impact. At Corvista, Adrian is leading a game-changing effort to expand access to frontline cardiac diagnostics. Their FDA-cleared point-of-care platform for coronary artery disease and pulmonary hypertension uses real-time electrical and hemodynamic signals analyzed by proprietary AI to deliver rapid, non-invasive results in under 30 minutes, no specialist required. This episode isn't about a device. It's about transforming how we think about innovation, clinical access, IP protection, and scaling technology in an increasingly complex healthcare landscape. Hey, Adrian, are you ready to be our guru today?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on, Tom. So excited to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to have you, and thank you for joining us. So tell us something fun or interesting about yourself or your family so we can get to know you a little better.
Yeah, sure. I always struggle to answer this question because I don't find myself particularly interesting. But two things I'll share. I'm half Burmese. So my mother was from Myanmar, and they actually, kind of emigrated from Myanmar back in the early days when the military junta was taking over the government, and they kind of had to flee. And so my mom is, they were, I have that kind of history and legacy, which is not that common, I suppose. Mm-hmm. Second thing that's interesting is I'm probably one of the only people from Hong Kong, this is where I grew up and where I'm from, that lived in Limerick in Ireland, which if you Google, Limerick is a place of a lot of medtech innovation and manufacturing and development. But it's also called Stab City. I didn't tell my mother that, I'll put it that way, when I was there. And I suppose the last thing, which is kind of cute, that I just found out recently, is my first boss 20 years ago when I graduated from college. I just found out 3 months ago that he was the guy who designed our Corvista version 1 device.
Oh, wow.
I only found that out after 3 months on the job. And I was like, hold on a second, I recognize that name. Yeah. And he was my first ever boss. So that's how small our world is.
Well, I'll make it even smaller with you because before we started recording, we were talking about Michigan, but my family roots actually come from Limerick, Ireland.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
Okay. So you know about the glory of Limerick.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, Adrian, you've raised capital and scaled teams. From your point of view, what's the one mistake you see early-stage medtech leaders make when they're trying to attract investors or strategic partners? Can you provide us some insights there?
Yeah, this question is a good one. And honestly, there are probably a lot of things because, venture is really about retiring 101 different risks, right? But I think what's worked really well for me, I think, is looking at the world like it's flat. And what I mean by that is a lot of, nowadays, every company, every university, every man and their dog is looking at spinning out new innovations, tech transfer and trying to create startups, right? And a lot of people I observe, really just focus in their own backyard. But I really think medtech, biotech, healthcare in general is, the world is flat. You need to know, what's going on in Chile, what's going on in France, what's going on with investigators in Switzerland. That's the way that you really know whether you are world class. And also you just need to learn. You just have to have a wider purview. That's number one. Number two is, I think there's a lot of value that I've gleaned from. I'm kind of a nerd with medical history, and I, take diabetes for instance. Not quite what we do, but diabetes right now in medtech is kind of, there's a few companies that look at resurfacing the duodenum, right? Like Fractal Health, and there's a few other companies like Aqua and Francis Medical, I believe. And the thing is, it's interesting because when diabetes used to be surgically treated in the early days, and then obviously the pharmacological agents, the drugs came along, and then it became generally a drug-treated disease state. And then now we're kind of going back. So it's, so understanding that medical history, what's been tried before, what failed. And this is, maybe a statement that is applicable to just general tech, right? You kind of know someone's probably tried it before, but you've got to understand why it didn't work back then, right? What's changed now? What technology improvements have actually opened up the viability of that business idea? So I think medical history is super important. And then lastly, I think you got to understand, I look at biotech and medtech as two sides of the same coin, actually, because, it is in some ways at natural competition with each other, right? How you treat a disease state. And so I think understanding both is actually very helpful. And then maybe one last one, actually, I just thought of is, I think when you're talking to investors, you always want to tell them how large your market opportunity is and how big the opportunity is. But there's a real skill, I think, in threading the needle of being focused in your strategy, but also tackling an area that can be potentially very huge and very large, right? How do you tread that line, and not sound that you are distracted or just too pie in the sky? None of that pie in the sky is going to work if your first application doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that, and thank you for the summary. And I was especially interested in the history, right? I actually work with a client that has a really cool product used in surgery for patient positioning, and they found the kind of the genesis of the idea by doing research and pulled an article from a 1956 Journal of Canadian Anesthesia, right? So you never know, right? And you're right. Sometimes it's just timing, right, as to what was going on 10, 20, 30, in this case, maybe like 70 years ago to current contemporary times, right? So it's really interesting to look at how technologies change, materials change, and it can impact the outcomes, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, fantastic. So, Adrian, you've worked with a number of innovators with innovation itself, right? In your experience, what does it take to truly build and sustain a culture of innovation inside a medtech organization?
Yeah, that is a good question. And my first response to that is I don't know, and I'm trying to find out, honestly. I think it's a continual journey. I think it starts with being, this is going to sound a bit cheesy, but I do think it's about aligning on the purpose first. That's number one. And once you align on the purpose, then you've kind of incentivized your team, number one. And number two, if you design your purpose and your mission correctly, and you form a philosophy around that mission, then it becomes very easy for the team to start thinking creatively about how to be innovative. And let me give you an example. When I came in, and I'm relatively sort of new to this role, I'm exactly 6 months in. One thing I noticed was that, when we launched our product in 2024, we have varying responses from the market, right? Some sites really love us, thankfully. Some sites quite like us, and then some sites like us less. And thinking back at early medtech sales and marketing, back in the day, products were simpler, meaning you unblock a tube, you stick two bones together, you ablate a nerve, or a pinpoint in the heart, right? You almost see the efficacy and the response of that immediately, and your decision maker is also the physician, right? So in some ways, products were a bit more simplistic back then. When I look at Corvista, I realize that we have so many stakeholders that actually touch our product, all the way from the nurses and the technicians who use the product, perhaps the IT manager that deals with the login names and the security measures, the payers and the administrators at our sites. Those are all our customers, actually, right? So the philosophy I brought, or I tried to bring a little bit more of, is that everyone is a stakeholder. And if you widen your purview of who the stakeholder is, then the solution set also gets wider. Now we're not just thinking about how the physician uses the device or the person who's operating the device, but also every single touch point where someone external to Corvista touches the Corvista system, to me, is a customer. And so when I sort of shared this philosophy of how I thought about it, it makes a lot of sense. It's not really rocket science, but I really, really hammered home this message. And so the team now thinks about every interaction with an external party, right? Not just in designing the algorithm and all the FDA considerations and all that, but even how we, issue login names and how we think about onboarding and the training. That's all part of the solution. And so the philosophy is important of how you consider your business, the unmet need, the customer base, and all that. And I think the last thing is you need to make sure your senior team are also aligned on first of all the purpose and also the philosophy, because you can't communicate all of that yourself. And so aligning with your senior team is super key, I think.
Yeah, I like that, right? Because I especially like the alignment of the mission, and expanding your focus on who your real customer is, because I think you're spot on there. And by that alignment, I think I'm sure you're finding innovations in other corners that you never really would think of, right? And we often talk about innovation sometimes isn't that big aha moment. It's how do you improve a process? And it might be that login, that can enhance workflow. Am I heading down the right path with you here?
Yeah, I think so. I think you said it better than me. I think it's the innovation is kind of a philosophy and a mindset almost. It's a state of mind in some ways. And from that, there are so many forms of innovation, right? It's when we think of innovation, we think about technical innovation, right? How do you design a smaller sensor and maybe an algorithm for diagnosing a data for analyzing a data set? But I think innovation can also come from your business operations. Your business model, obviously, there's a lot of innovative business models that are now enabled by the tech advancements of today. But also how you kind of source the innovative ideas. So one thing that I'm quite proud about, and I think is working for us, is we work with some interns, right? And honestly, some of these interns are super sharp, super talented. And a lot of the time when you hire interns, you give them something to do, right? You give them a use case and a problem set to solve. What we did was we rehired some of our older interns, and we said, "You tell us what you want to work on. Just float around the company and observe." And actually, this is very interesting to them because these new young talented machine learning engineers, they actually know everything they can about algorithm development and data science and all that, but they don't necessarily have the business use case to apply their skill sets too. And that's what they're looking for. So
Yeah.
you'd be surprised. And I think every generation thinks a bit differently, right? They're a bit different culture-wise, communication-wise. And I think you need to get, some of our really good ideas come from the 24-year-olds, as opposed to the slightly older staff on our team.
Yeah, I like that. And not to hammer the point too hard, but I was just having this conversation yesterday with somebody in HR, right? Because I've been in this business for a long time, 40 plus years, right? And they're like, well, how do you relate to younger individuals? And I was like, well, at one point I was one of those, right? But I think it really does come back to that alignment of the mission, right? Because if everybody's aligned there, then generationally, it doesn't really matter as much, right? Because you're right. You can look at the talent and the insights that somebody that might be much younger and match that up with somebody much older. And I think at the heart of that, you're going to find innovation, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Good ideas come from everywhere.
Yeah.
And I think it's the responsibility of leadership to make, not as a leader and a manager, depending on how you manage and how you lead, sometimes information doesn't get floated up to you, for whatever reason, for 1,000,001 reasons. So it's actually the leader's responsibility to make sure that information is getting floated up to him and so that he can make the best decisions, he or she can make the best decisions.
Yeah. Fantastic. And Adrian, in your background, working with some of the startups, you've got some expertise in intellectual property. So I'm just kind of curious, I know you're newer in your role at Corvista, but from a startup's perspective, how should a medtech innovator be thinking about protecting their intellectual property? And then how do you approach that strategically? Do you have any thoughts for us there?
Yeah, I have a host of experiences, some good, some bad, and I'll just share that. It's not prescriptive by any means, but there's a general answer to this, which is not just on IP. The thing about medtech development is it's a long path, right? Relatively speaking, not as long as biotech, but it's still a long path. And actually, you need to have the end goal in mind. So that is very unnatural, right? Because you're trying to lock down a technology and see if it works. It seems like the reimbursement pathway is just so far in the future that it's, maybe not relevant to think about now. I think that's a mistake. You need to kind of paint the picture of how your next 5 to 10 years is going to be. It's a really, really hard exercise. And I think with IP in particular, you kind of need to think about it very early, because ultimately, if you create something valuable, you need to be able to protect it. And so by default, it's one of the most important things. And acquirers and and institutional investors, they care about that, the protection of the asset. Now, consideration of the IP strategy and doing something about it and spending legal dollars and IP freedom to operate dollars, that's a different consideration. So, a friend of mine at Cooley actually gave me a very good example. He said, it's kind of like racing, Formula One. I'm a fan of Formula One. You want to overtake someone at some point, but not every single turn and not every single lap is the right time to do it. There is a time, and it could be 5 laps from now, 6 turns from now. And I think you need to know when that is. So the tactical consideration about when to really kind of pull the trigger is important, because you can't be spending all that money and, doing a freedom to operate, for instance. A freedom to operate is both defensive and offensive. Am I infringing? Am I going to be infringed on? But you can have that scope of investigation very, very broad. Like, look at Corvista. Do I cover everything in cardiology? Our freedom to operate exercise is going to cost hundreds of thousands. That's the case. Or do I just do coronary artery disease with a non-invasive diagnostic? That's much more narrow, but maybe it's too narrow, right? So it's actually a little bit of a judgment call, but you need to be thinking about it strategically early. And then you work with your team and your patent attorneys, perhaps, maybe some early investors and directors to think about the tactical side of things.
I love the Formula One analogy, right? Because that's so spot on, right? Because there's so many other things you've got to manage, right? I mean, with startups, it's the amount of money and the cost of doing some things, right? So when do you do that? When you're going to have to make that pit stop, right, to get more fuel, or in this case, venture money, and et cetera. So I love that analogy. It really brought it home for me. So I appreciate
Thank
that.
you. Yeah. And, just an additional point on that, right? It's, I think IP strategy is very much, there's a sort of two sides to it, right? There's the defensive side and the offensive side, right? Defensive side is, do I have something to protect my own product and so that people don't infringe on my inventions? But the offensive side is, it's a bit more sort of strategic, where maybe I patent a little bit more widely, and so it prevents people from, or having a tougher time to come in and infringe on our space. How you think about the defensive coverage and the offensive attacking kind of strategy are two separate things. And I think there's no right or wrong. I think it's just about how being very, very practical about it too. But you need to think about both sides.
Yeah, gotcha. And Adrian, I'd like to shift the conversation out to a little more about Corvista, right? Because looking at what you and your team are doing, I mean, new product development and diagnostics is really no easy feat, right? And I'm just kind of curious if you could share with us what were some of the biggest R&D or technical hurdles you had to overcome to get your products and your concepts to market.
Yeah. So I'll caveat my answer with saying that, I'm relatively recent and new to the role. And I think a lot of the heavy lifting of getting through regulatory, I was an outsider. I was an investor. So I've been observing the company, and I've known the company for 8 years. There's just a caveat. But what I would say is, I love this phrase that someone shared to me. Pioneers actually get the arrows, and the what is it? The followers get the land, or what is it? The early bird gets the worm, but it's the second mouse that gets the cheese, right? I love these kind of analogies because when you're doing something very, very new, there's just going to be regulatory guidance and regulatory uncertainty, perhaps maybe reimbursement uncertainty. And in a way, we were, I wouldn't say victim to that, but it's something that we definitely had a lot of back and forths, and we had to be very dynamic and agile. We started our clinical trials back in, I think it's like 2014, about 2016 perhaps, so it's been a while, right? And back then the clarity in guidance is not quite there, And so I think that's just something that there's no really two ways around it. That's number one. But something a little bit more tangible would be, I think the regulatory hurdle, or maybe even the technical hurdle, can be mitigated if innovators are very, very clear on their intended use and intended use population, right? You don't want to be an everything to everyone. You also want to be selecting your patient, your clinical subjects correctly, and to make sure that the data you generate in your clinical studies is actually applicable to the real world use of your product. I mean, regulators and payers are very, very astute they know about that, and so they would look at that and say, have you chosen your comparators correctly? So I think being very, very clear on which type of patient, which type of user is going to use your product is extremely important. And I'll use a real example here. A lot of people ask us, are you a screening tool? Screening implies that you have an asymptomatic population looking for kind of asymptomatic disease or silent disease, right? We are actually not that. We have been validated and cleared for the symptomatic population. It's totally fine for us because that population is humongous. It's just the largest addressable market in the world, right? Cardiovascular symptomatic patients and disease. So we have no problem with, say, customer demand and all that. But we were very deliberate about saying we are targeting the symptomatic population, and the unmet need was the primary care physician or or some of the in outpatient care, they just don't know where to send you, and that is the pain point, right? Most people suspect coronary disease because it's so common, so they send you to the cardiologist. But actually, it might have been better to send you down to the pulmonologist, or perhaps investigate you for heart failure. These are all very different investigation paths, and you just have that sort of unknown diagnostic dilemma at the point of care. So that's the problem that we are targeting, and we validated our product and the technology and the performance in that particular setting. So that's very, very important.
Yeah.
And I would say that removing AI is all about trying to design it ethically and to try to design out bias. That's something that is something that's not very easily done. I'd say, like, think about your development and how you can remove bias, be it gender, be it race, be it socioeconomic class, be it where that patient presents. Like, there are a lot of biases, and you just sometimes don't know how what the algorithm can spit out sometimes.
Yeah, gotcha. That's really helpful. So, Adrian, also, in our world with medtech startups, many of them struggle with gaining clinical access, and I'm curious how Corvista, how do you and your team engage clinicians early, and what advice do you have for startups trying to build those really critical partnerships for validation and commercialization? Do you have any insights for us there?
There's going to be some things that our audience probably would have heard, which is just the warm intros.
Mm-hmm.
The world is very noisy, in my opinion. Nowadays, there's a million voices. There's so much content, and so sort of cutting through, separating the wheat from the chaff, and getting a warm engagement is key. So warm introductions is key. Number one.
Mm-hmm.
Number two is. This one is is I think very relevant, which is understanding that unmet need, whether it's a clinician, whether it's a principal, if it's a principal investigator clinician, or if it's a company that you want to collaborate with, or a university or a teaching hospital. I think an understanding of unmet need and how it might not necessarily be purely clinical is quite key. Right? There are pains in business, in workflow efficiency, right? There are institutions that struggle with profitability and utilization of assets, right? Those are also unmet needs. It's not, we don't, in healthcare, we don't really categorize those as unmet needs usually, but in my opinion, unmet needs are broader than just the clinical medical needs. There are lots of business needs as well. And I think when you align and you think about that carefully, then I think the engagement process with as you mentioned, clinical access, is actually expedited and actually a lot more smooth. So I think it's understanding that these clinicians are not just trying to see technologies that can improve diagnostic accuracy by a few percentage points, but are we actually helping them with technical fatigue, right? Technical burden. Are we introducing yet another sign-on to yet another app? That's a real problem too. So it's wider than clinical. So having a wider lens is, I think, key.
Yeah, I like that, right? Because it kind of links back to our discussion on innovation, right? Because what we're doing is we're bringing an innovation or a change to these end users, these providers, perhaps, right? And looking at how are we going to make them more efficient with what they're doing. So that alignment to mission, I think, carries over to our customers, correct?
Yeah.
So, Adrian, AI is becoming more central to diagnostics. And I'm curious how you and your team balance the promise of machine learning with the need for clinical trust and explainability in the decision-making process. Can you help us out with that a little bit?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question, and honestly, one of the most significant considerations as we onboard clinicians and customers and roll out our product. I think that on one hand, the promise of machine learning and AI is quite well understood. I think there's no limit to the imagination of a lot of people on that. But explainability, I'll treat trust and explainability I'll consider them separately. I think explainability is key because, as you know, the first generation of deep learning and generative AI models and technologies are, kind of a black box, right? So the problem is the hallucinations. And I imagine we're going to get there pretty soon where the hallucinations are going to be manageable, but not yet. And I'd say right now it's very, very hard to get through the regulators if you have a complete black box and you can't explain your type 2 errors, for instance, your false positives and your false negatives. If and when you get through that, you have an even higher hurdle with explaining to your physician customers and your customers about how this technology could work and where it could go wrong. That is actually, in my opinion, an even larger hurdle. And so I think it's about applying the right type of AI in the right use case. So we talk about AI very, very broadly, right? It's a term that's thrown around. And I think generally when people talk about AI, I think that it's considering kind of it is considering generative AI. But we use machine learning models and more sort of conventional complex mathematics and more pure machine learning for our diagnostic algorithm. Now, that is key because essentially we can actually explain everything inside there. It's not a black box. We can actually, what we do is we take the electrical activity, which is really a waveform, and then we take the hemodynamics, which is also a waveform. It's actually two waveforms, red light and infrared light. Ultimately, it's just all numbers, and we derive, a lot of insight and features from these signals, and it's very, very quantitative. And so we are able to explain everything that's going on, and that really helps us.
Mm-hmm.
I think and then what we use generative AI for is actually the back end operations, business efficiency, workflow improvement, analysis and research, right? Because those are areas where you can afford to have some false positives or false negatives or some hallucinations. You're not immediately making a medical decision based on that, potentially hallucinated outcome, right? So I think knowing which type of AI, which type of model, which type of analysis, how much to supervise, when to use, when to use what type of AI very, very deliberately is something that I think can really, really help. So that's a really, really huge thing.
Yeah, that's helpful. And to build on that, Adrian, if I've got this right, you had a recent publication in the ERJ Open Research Journal, and it added credibility to your pulmonary hypertension work. How important is clinical evidence in building momentum, not just for the FDA, but also for market access? Do you have any thoughts for us there?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And this is a great question that relates to an earlier question that you asked, right? About, where I commented about unmet need, identifying the unmet need, right? So again, a lot of, when you think about clinical data and clinical evidence, there is safety and efficacy and performance, right? And that really gets you through the regulatory hurdle. But in healthcare, fortunately or unfortunately, you also need to consider the payer, right? Things need to be reimbursed. And the payer is obviously a very large part, if not the largest part of our ecosystem. Things need to be paid for. That type of data is really about clinical utility, outcomes, not just about safety and efficacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, publications are important. Clinical evidence is extremely important. But I would say that you need to be clear on the various types of clinical evidence that you generate, and they could point to different things, right? So I would say that we are great in terms of our performance and our diagnostic accuracy. And we have a lot of we already have some clinical evidence building in the outcomes. Can we improve patient outcomes? Can we reduce healthcare costs over a period of time? Can we improve utilization of healthcare infrastructure? And those are equally important in terms of in terms of clinical evidence, and that makes sense because if you consider unmet needs in a wider lens, then you also need to demonstrate the value in terms of a wider lens. So it's extremely important and something that we are super focused on.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So, Adrian, it seems like this is a really exciting time for you and your team at Corvista. What does the future hold? Where are you going from here?
Yeah, hopefully we can, or not. Well, I say hopefully we can treat as many patients as we can, and unfortunately, we are targeting the largest patient pool. So we are excited that we have built a technology and a business where it can really get to the furthest reaches of every underserved rural and remote community. I think we are one of the more pioneering companies in that setting. There's a lot of research in the tertiary institutions, right? Even companies going to space and all that. But but I think it's a pretty high challenge to make a business model work in rural Alabama, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'm actually very excited for that because, it's about getting to every corner of the globe. What I'm more tangibly interested in and excited for is our heart failure indication, which we have recently locked down and with, I think, arguably best-in-class, non-invasive, best-in-class accuracy. Heart failure is obviously a huge unmet need medically, clinically, but also in terms of the healthcare system, right? Talk about the 30-day rehospitalization risk and the readmissions. It's just a humongous burden to the healthcare system. And so when we have that indication approved, it's going to make us a 3-in-1 test, one fell swoop. And also it relates to pulmonary hypertension because, a big proportion of pulmonary hypertension is secondary to heart failure. So you start having that kind of Venn diagram. What happens when you have a double negative on the test? What happens when you have a double positive? What happens if you have only a single positive? Those different outcomes or those different kind of categories actually point to a different line of investigation, which ultimately helps the physician decide what to do and how to manage that patient. So that becomes really interesting. Second is we have seemingly a burgeoning use case in drug monitoring and management, which is because, technically you could use the Corvista 4 times a day. We don't put any energy into the body. It's super safe. It's super quick. And the access point is so accessible. And so we really open up the whole drug monitoring in the outpatient setting. You obviously don't want to be managed on your drug in a tertiary hospital every single time. So we open that up, and I think that's super interesting because you can really optimally dose. You can find out, whether a patient is no longer responding to a drug earlier than you would when you look at just outright progression, for instance. So right now in pulmonary hypertension, patients are given a fixed dose, and then a lot of the time they only change drugs when there's outright obvious progression. That's obviously not optimal medical management, And I think from the science, what's most interesting is because we're kind of looking at the pump and the pipes at the same time, we're a multimodal technology. It's like a new phenotypic lens. It's like a new way of looking at the body, which is something that some of the AI radiology companies and some of the single mode companies are, they don't necessarily have that kind of insight. So that's what I'm kind of most excited about from the power of our Corvista technology.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It sounds like a very exciting time. So, Adrian, first of all, I'd like to thank you and acknowledge you for the time and insights that you brought to us today, for being our guru. If somebody wants to find out a little bit more, how do we learn more about you and your team? Is there a website? Are you on LinkedIn? How do we get some more information?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very active on LinkedIn. You can email me at alam, ALAM at corvista.com. You can look at our website. There's a contact me. And you can, of course, find Tom from MedTech Gurus. And I'm sure Tom will also be great at connecting, innovators and collaborators. So multiple ways to find us.
Yeah. Yeah, and absolutely, we will connect. We do that often here at MedTech Gurus. So, Adrian, once again, thank you so much for your time and the insights you brought to us as our guru today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure. Great to meet everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to MedTech Gurus. I am Sylvester Harris, your MC. If you want to learn more about Tom and his consulting services, you can go to www.pctmedical.com or email Tom at tom@pctmedical.com. Now, I can be reached at Sylvester Harris, that's SylvesterHarris 5048@gmail.com, and I'd be pleased to discuss any voiceover work that you may want for your company or broadcast. Hey, thanks so much for listening, and catch us on the next episode of MedTech Gurus.